The camera flashes were blinding. Hundreds of them, all at once, like a lightning storm contained inside one room. The grand ballroom of the Lotte Sol Hotel had seen powerful men before. Politicians, oligarchs, men who moved markets with a single phone call. But there was something different about Kang Ji-hoon tonight. He stood at the podium in a black tuxedo that fit him like armor, jaw set, eyes carrying the weight of someone who had survived something most people never could. Around him, the who's who of Korean business society glittered in designer gowns and tailored suits. Crystal glasses caught the chandelier light. Conversation hummed like electricity through the room. Then he leaned forward into the microphone, and the entire world went quiet. "There is something I need to say tonight," he began, his voice low and deliberate, the kind of voice that made boardrooms sit up straight without knowing why. Something that has nothing to do with quarterly earnings or stock, projections, or the Hanul Group's expansion into Southeast Asia. A ripple of confused murmuring moved through the crowd. Ji-hoon's eyes swept the room slowly, the way a man looks when he is searching for one specific star in an entire sky. And then he found her, standing near the back of the ballroom in a simple midnight blue gown, holding a glass of water she hadn't touched, was Ava, 25 years old. Dark hair pinned loosely at her nape, eyes wide and uncertain, like she always looked when the world moved faster than she expected it to. "The woman I have loved for 10 years, Ji-hoon said, and his voice cracked, just barely, just enough for the people in the front row to notice, is standing right here." The silence that followed was deafening. Then the cameras erupted. Every reporter in the room turned, craning necks, phones lifting, flashes blazing toward the back of the ballroom, where Ava stood completely frozen, her water glass tilted dangerously in her hand. The woman beside her caught it before it fell. Ava's lips parted. Her eyes met his across the length of the enormous room, through hundreds of people, through 10 years of silence and absence and unanswered questions, and everything inside her chest collapsed inward, like a building that had been quietly waiting to fall. She had no idea this was coming. She had no idea, because she didn't know who he was until 3 weeks ago. And 3 weeks ago had changed everything. 10 years earlier, there was a foster home in Busan. It sat on a narrow road near the port, the kind of street where the salt from the sea worked its way into the walls and never quite left. The building was old, perpetually damp in winter, perpetually too warm in summer, with a garden out back that the children were supposed to maintain, but mostly neglected, except for one girl who went out there every afternoon without fail. Ava had been planting marigolds the first time Ji-hoon arrived. She was 15, small for her age. With paint-stained fingers and a sketchbook, she carried the way other kids carried phones. Always, everywhere, like it was an extension of herself. She had been at the foster home for 2 years by then, long enough to understand the rhythms of the place, the moods of the house mother, which kids would be moved on quickly, and which ones, like her, seemed to stay indefinitely. Ji-hoon arrived on a Tuesday in March. He was 16, tall even then, with the kind of quiet that made adults nervous and children instinctively respectful. He didn't cry, didn't fight, didn't complain about the narrow bed or the lukewarm dinner. He just sat at the table that first night and watched everyone with careful, assessing eyes. Ava watched him back. "You're going to hate the bathroom schedule," she told him across the table, completely seriously. "Thursdays are the worst. Jae-won takes 40 minutes, and nobody can stop him." Ji-hoon had stared at her for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. It was a short laugh, surprised out of him, like he'd forgotten he was capable of making that sound. "Good to know," he said. They became inseparable within a month. Not in an obvious way. They didn't announce it, didn't make it a thing the other kids noticed right away. It was quieter than that. It was Ji-hoon sitting in the garden while Ava sketched, not saying anything, just being there. It was Ava saving him the seat by the window in the common room because she'd noticed he always looked outside when he was thinking. It was him showing up one day with a new sketchbook, the good kind, with thick, creamy pages that held charcoal without smearing, and setting it on her bed without a word. "Where did you get this?" she asked, finding him in the hallway. "Bought it," he said, not stopping. "With what money? We don't get allowance until Friday." He glanced over his shoulder. "I've been working at the fish market on weekends. Don't make it a big deal." She made it a big deal. She chased him down the hallway and grabbed his arm and made him turn around. And she looked at him with those eyes that always seemed to see more than they should. "Ji-hoon, you spent your whole week's wages on a sketchbook for me. You ran out of pages. That's not the point." "It is the point," he said. And something in his tone stopped her argument cold. He looked at her steadily. "Your drawings are good, Ava. You're going to be a designer someday. You need paper." She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she hugged him. He went very still, the way he always did when someone was kind to him unexpectedly, like his body wasn't quite sure what to do with gentleness. Then slowly, awkwardly, he hugged her back. That was how it was between them, unspoken, solid, the kind of bond that doesn't require explanation because it simply exists, like gravity. She told him about Seoul, about the fashion programs at the universities there, about the design studios she'd read about in magazines, about how she was going to get there someday and build something real. He listened to every word with complete seriousness, never once telling her to be realistic, never once suggesting the odds were against her. He just listened, and sometimes he asked questions that were so precise they surprised her. What kind of design? What aesthetic? What did she want her work to feel like? "Like it remembers something," she told him once, struggling to explain it. "Like when you look at it, you feel like you've seen it before, but you haven't, like it's already inside you somewhere." He was quiet for a long moment. "That's what home feels like," he said finally. She never forgot that. Then came the night everything changed. It was storming. The violent, sideways rain that came off the Yellow Sea in autumn and turned the streets of Busan into rivers. Ava had been sketching by the window when she saw the car. A black luxury sedan, the kind that didn't belong on their street, idling at the curb with its headlights cutting through the rain. She watched the house mother go to the door, watched the conversation happen, watched the woman's face shift into that expression Ava had learned to recognize, the careful brightness of an adult trying not to show that something was about to hurt someone. She was in the hallway when Ji-hoon came out of the house mother's office with his coat already on and a single duffel bag in his hand. He stopped when he saw her. "Ji-hoon." Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "What's happening?" "I'm being adopted." He said it flatly, the way he said things when he was trying to protect himself from them. "A businessman in Seoul. It happened fast. They want me to leave tonight." Tonight. The word hit her like a physical thing. She looked at the duffel bag. She looked at his face, at the way his jaw was tight, and his eyes were doing that thing where they went very controlled and gave nothing away. "You're leaving tonight," she repeated. "Yes. You're leaving tonight, and you didn't. Nobody told me. I just found out an hour ago." He set the bag down. He crossed the space between them, and he stood in front of her, and she realized she was shaking slightly, from cold or shock or something she didn't have a name for. "Ava, look at me." She looked at him. "I'm going to come back," he said. "I'm going to get to Seoul. I'm going to figure it out, and I'm going to come back. And when I do—" He stopped. He seemed to be deciding something. Then, "When I do, you won't have to struggle anymore. I'll make sure of it." "You can't promise that," she said, even though everything in her desperately wanted him to promise it. "I'm promising it anyway." He picked up his bag. He looked at her one more time with those careful, serious eyes that had always made her feel like she was the only person in the room. "Wait for me." He walked out into the rain. She stood at the window and watched the black car's taillights disappear down the street. He never came back. Not in 1 year. Not in 3. Not in 5. The letter she wrote to the address the house mother gave her came back unopened after a few months, marked with a forwarding notification she couldn't trace. When she turned 18 and aged out of the foster system, she packed her own single bag, got on a bus to Seoul, and decided that waiting was finished. She was going to build something for herself, alone, the way she'd always known she might have to. She buried the memory of a boy in the rain, and she kept moving. Seoul was harder than the magazines had suggested. Design programs cost money she didn't have, so she took courses where she could, night classes, online certifications, every free workshop she could find. She worked in a convenience store during the day and designed logos for small businesses on the side for rates that barely covered her transit card. She built a portfolio one piece at a time, slowly, stubbornly, with the same focused persistence that had always been her defining feature. She applied to Hanul Group because they were the best. She didn't expect to hear back. She sent the application at midnight on a Wednesday, went to sleep, and woke up to an interview request before her alarm went off. The corporate headquarters was everything she'd imagined, and nothing she was ready for. Glass and steel climbing 40 floors into a gray Seoul morning, lobby staff in matching gray uniforms, the kind of silence that meant money in every corner. She rode the elevator up to the creative division with her portfolio under her arm and told herself she wasn't intimidated, which was something she'd learned to do. Tell herself things firmly until they became approximately true. The interview panel was 3 people. She answered every question directly, honestly, with the kind of candor that sometimes made interviewers uncomfortable and sometimes made them lean forward. She talked about growing up without resources, about learning to be resourceful instead, about what she wanted to create and why it mattered. She was almost to the door when the panel leader said, "One moment. Mr. Kang would like to meet with you directly." Ava stopped. "Mr. Kang? The CEO?" "Yes, he's reviewed your portfolio. Please follow me." The office at the top of the building was enormous and almost aggressively minimal. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Seoul, a single massive desk, no personal items visible anywhere. She was standing in the center of the room when she heard the door close behind her, and she turned. The man standing by the window had his back to her initially. Dark suit, broad shoulders. The posture of someone who had learned to take up space precisely and deliberately. Then he turned. He was strikingly handsome in the way that powerful men sometimes are. Not pretty, but structured. Sharp jaw. Dark eyes that were doing something she couldn't immediately name. He looked at her for a moment that stretched slightly too long before he spoke. "Ava," he said. Not a question. Not an introduction. Just her name, in a voice she didn't recognize. She felt something strange move through her. Not recognition exactly. More like an echo. Like hearing a song you used to know played in a different key. "Yes," she said. "Ava Shin. Thank you for seeing me, Mr. Kang." He looked at her for another long moment. Something shifted in his expression. Controlled. Quick. Gone before she could identify it. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He remained standing, which she suspected was deliberate. "Why should I hire you?" he asked. Blunt. No preamble. "Because I've built more with less than anyone else you'll interview," she said. "I don't have a degree from a prestigious program. I don't have connections in the industry. I have 10 years of figuring out how to do more with nothing. and I have a portfolio that demonstrates it. If you're looking for someone who already knows how things are done, I'm not the right choice. If you're looking for someone who will find a way regardless, I'm the only choice." His expression didn't change. She couldn't tell if she'd impressed him or irritated him, and she wasn't sure which one would be better. "You'll start Monday," he said. She blinked. "I'm sorry?" "You're hired. Junior creative position. You'll start Monday." He turned back to the window. "My assistant will send you the details." She walked out of that building with her heart hammering and her mind completely off balance, already trying to understand what had just happened and why. For one brief moment when their eyes met, she had felt like she was standing somewhere she'd been before. Working at Hanul Group was like being dropped into the middle of a river and told to figure out swimming later. The pace was relentless. The standards were exacting. The other junior creatives had credentials she didn't, and they made sure she knew it, not cruelly exactly, but with the specific precision of people who believe hierarchy is both natural and correct. Director Choi was the worst of them, senior enough to make her assignments miserable, experienced enough to identify every weakness in her process, and specific enough in his critiques that she spent her first week going home with her jaw aching from how hard she'd been clenching it all day. But the project stayed hers. Every time Director Choi moved to pull her off an assignment, and she learned later that it happened twice in the first month, something stopped it. An override from above, a reassignment that conveniently left her on the work she'd been doing. She asked her teammate about it once, and got only a shrug and, "Mr. Kang pays attention to everything." She didn't know what that meant. She tried not to think about it too much. She thought about it constantly. It was the small things that accumulated. The elevator, for instance. It happened 3 times in 2 weeks that she was leaving late. Exhausted, portfolio bag cutting into her shoulder, and the elevator doors opened to reveal him. Ji-hoon, she'd started thinking of him in her head, because Mr. Kang felt too formal for someone she couldn't stop being curious about. He was always alone at those hours. He would look at her, step aside to make room, and the ride down 40 floors would happen in a silence that felt too loaded to be accidental. He never initiated conversation. Neither did she, because something in her chest went quiet and strange around him, and she didn't know what to do with that. Then there was the night she fell asleep at her desk. She'd been working on a pitch deck for a new campaign, the kind of work that required complete visual precision and therefore took 3 times as long as regular work. And she told herself she would just rest her eyes for a moment and then get back to it. She woke up at 2 in the morning to find the office empty and dark except for her desk light and something warm over her shoulders. His jacket, perfectly folded, laid over her like a blanket. She sat with it for a long moment in the dark office, his jacket over her shoulders, and she breathed in something that was wood smoke and cedar, and something else she couldn't name but immediately wanted to remember, and she felt, with absolute irrational certainty, that she had been this warm before somewhere. A long time ago. The art supplies arrived at her apartment 4 days later. No card, a set of Copic markers she'd been looking at online for 6 months and couldn't justify buying, 12 pencils graded in a range she'd never been able to afford, 3 hardback sketchbooks with exactly the right paper weight. She sat on her apartment floor surrounded by them and felt something crack open in her chest that she didn't want to examine too closely. She went to work the next day and looked at him across the glass-walled meeting room and thought, "Who are you?" The gala was a company event, the annual Hanul Group Foundation benefit, mandatory attendance for all creative staff at the senior level and above, optional for junior staff, but heavily implied. Ava went because she needed to be seen, because her position was still new enough that invisibility was a risk. She borrowed a red dress from her colleague Mina and spent more time on her makeup than she had in months, and told herself this was professional development. She did not tell herself she was hoping he would see her. She told herself the opposite, firmly, several times on the taxi ride over. The ballroom was overwhelming, the kind of beautiful that makes you feel slightly underdressed, regardless of what you're wearing. She found her table, smiled at the people she recognized, accepted a glass of water she nursed for an hour, and tried to feel comfortable in a room that cost more per hour than she made in a month. She saw him immediately upon arriving. Impossible not to. He was in the center of every room he occupied, not by positioning himself there, but because the architecture of attention simply organized itself around him. He was speaking with an older board member and not looking at her, and she turned away before he could catch her looking. What she did see, an hour later, was the woman. Tall, flawlessly dressed, the kind of woman who moved through expensive rooms like they had been built specifically for her. She appeared beside Ji-hoon at the cocktail hour and placed her hand on his arm with the ease of long familiarity. And Ava heard her say to the cluster of people around them, clearly, with a bright and practiced smile, "Ji-hoon and I have been discussing the future together for quite some time. I think everyone will be very pleased with what's coming." The implication was obvious. The way the people around them smiled, knowing, unsurprised, made it more so. Ava turned back to her drink and noticed, with clinical detachment, and a feeling she absolutely refused to name, that her chest hurt. She stayed another 40 minutes out of obligation, then excused herself on the pretext of retrieving a file from the creative floor. In reality, she needed air and distance from the sound of that woman's laugh and the specific torture of watching someone touch his arm that casually. She was not in love with him. She had told herself this multiple times, and she intended to keep telling herself until it became true. She took the elevator to the 38th floor, where the creative suite was quiet and dark, found the file she'd used as her excuse, and then, because she was still looking for somewhere to breathe, walked down the hall to the executive floor and into his office to drop off the documents she'd been meaning to leave for a week. His office was dim, lit only by the city coming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She moved to his desk and set the folder down, and then she looked up. There was something on the credenza behind his desk that hadn't been there before. Maybe she'd never looked closely enough. A frame. Dark wood. Small. The kind you put a photograph in. She crossed toward it without fully deciding to. The photograph was old, printed on slightly faded paper, the color slightly washed by time. Two teenagers sitting on what appeared to be the steps of a house, a girl with paint-stained hands and dark hair, laughing at something off camera. A boy beside her, not laughing, but watching her with an expression so unguarded that even in the faded photograph it was striking. Ava's hand went to her mouth. The steps. The railing she'd helped repaint that one summer. The marigolds barely visible at the edge of the frame. The girl's sketchbook, half visible, tucked under her arm. Her. That was her. Her hands were shaking. The room tilted very slightly. She looked at the boy, really looked at him, and she saw, beneath 16 years and $1 billion, and the careful architecture of power he'd built around himself, the face she had watched disappear into the rain. "Ji-hoon," she whispered. "Ava." His voice was directly behind her. She spun. He was standing in the doorway of his own office, still in his gala clothes, jacket in one hand, watching her, with an expression she'd never seen on him, raw, stripped, the careful control entirely gone. He looked like someone waiting for a verdict they already knew. She couldn't speak. She looked from him to the photograph and back, and her brain was doing the thing it did when something too large came at it all at once, where it simply stopped processing and left her standing in the wreckage. "How long?" she finally managed. "How long have you known it was me?" "Since your interview," he said quietly. Something moved through her that was complicated and enormous. You knew since the interview. Yes. And you didn't say anything. No. Why? The word came out sharp, louder than she meant it. Why didn't you? Her voice broke. She pressed her fingers against her mouth for a moment. I thought you forgot. Ji-hoon, I thought I wasn't. Ava. He crossed the room in 4 steps, and the urgency of it stopped her voice completely. He stopped close enough that she could see the tension in every line of him, the way he was holding himself together through some enormous act of will. You were never forgotten. Not for a single day. Then why didn't you come back? He exhaled. He looked at her, like she was asking him to open something that had been sealed for a very long time. Let me show you something, he said. He didn't take her back to the gala. He took her upstairs, to the rooftop garden on the 40th floor that she hadn't known existed, where Seoul burned and glittered in every direction like a circuit board lit from within. The wind was steady and cold, and it cut right through her borrowed red dress, and he took his jacket and put it over her shoulders without asking, the same way he'd covered her at her desk, and she wondered how many times he had taken care of her without her knowing. They stood at the railing, and he told her everything. He told her about arriving in Seoul at 16 to an adoptive father who turned out to be controlling in ways no one had mentioned during the adoption process, about phone privileges being revoked within the first month, about letters being intercepted. He only learned this years later from a housekeeper who finally told him what had happened to the things he'd tried to send, about being taken abroad at 17 for schooling, moved from country to country for 3 years, while his adoptive father managed his education like a business investment, always with the implicit threat that non-compliance would have consequences. He told her about turning 20 and finally having enough independence to search for her, and finding that she had aged out of the foster system and left no forwarding information, and how that felt, the particular despair of searching and finding only absence. He told her about building the company, about how every decision, every sacrifice, every 70-hour week had been oriented by something that was almost irrational in its consistency, the need to become someone who deserved to come back. Not just financially, not just professionally, to become someone who could stand in front of her and say, I built something real. I kept my word. I came back. He had been searching for her for 3 years before she walked into his office. I had investigators looking, he said quietly, looking at the city. I'd had them for 3 years. And then you sent an application to my company. And my assistant flagged it because the portfolio was exceptional, and I saw your name, and He stopped. He pressed his lips together. I sat in my chair for 20 minutes before I could do anything. Ava was crying. She hadn't decided to, but she was, quietly, the tears moving down her face in the cold, rooftop air. I thought you chose not to come back, she said. I thought you got to Seoul, and you got a family, and you just decided that the girl in the foster home wasn't worth the trip. Ava. The way he said her name was like something torn open. He turned from the railing to face her. There has not been a version of my life in which you weren't worth it. Do you understand that? I built all of this. He gestured at the city, at the building beneath their feet, at the whole illuminated skyline of his empire. I didn't do it for power. I didn't do it for money. I did it so I could come back to you without nothing. I didn't want to come back as the same kid who left. I wanted to come back as someone who could protect you. Someone who could give you the life you deserved. She stepped toward him. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, the way you touch something you're not sure is real. And his whole body went still under her hand, the same way it used to when she was kind to him unexpectedly. You were always worth coming back to, she told him, even with nothing. His hand came up and covered hers, pressing it against his face, He closed his eyes. 10 years of distance collapsed in that moment, quietly, without drama, like a held breath finally released. "I never stopped looking for you," he said. "I know," she said. "I know now." They stayed on the rooftop until the city's lights dimmed slightly with the approaching dawn, and by the time they went back inside, something had been rebuilt between them that had never fully broken in the first place. Then, the world found out. Director Choi had clearly been waiting. The story broke 3 days later, meticulously documented, selectively worded, designed to cause maximum damage. Former foster siblings, CEO, and junior employee. The implication of impropriety built carefully into every line without ever being stated directly. The story spread across every major business publication and 3 tabloids within 6 hours. The board called an emergency meeting at 8 the following morning. Ava sat in her apartment watching the headlines multiply on her phone and felt the familiar weight of a world reminding her of her place in it. Ji-hoon called at 7:59. "Don't read the comments," he said without greeting. "Too late." "Are you all right?" She considered lying and decided against it. "No." "Are you?" "I will be." A pause. "Come to the press conference at noon." "Ji-hoon, I'm not asking you to say anything. I just need you there." She came. The press conference was in the main lobby. 200 reporters, 17 cameras, the board visible behind a glass partition, with expressions ranging from stoic to quietly furious. Ji-hoon stood at the podium in a dark suit and looked like a man who had made up his mind a long time ago and was only now telling everyone about it. "I'll address the situation directly," he said. "Ava Shin and I grew up in the same foster home in Busan. We are not related by blood. We never have been. There is nothing in our history, our relationship, or my professional decisions that violates any legal, ethical, or corporate policy. What I will also say," he paused. The room was utterly silent. "Is that the framing of this story as something to be ashamed of says considerably more about the people who wrote it than it does about either of us. The foster care system gave us both a roof when we had nothing. It is not a scandal. It is a beginning." He looked directly at Ava, standing near the back of the lobby in her work clothes, heart hammering, hands clasped tightly in front of her. "And Ava," his voice changed. The press conference cadence dropped away completely, and what replaced it was just him. Just Ji-hoon, the 16-year-old boy who had stood in the rain and made her a promise. "I have been trying to find my way back to you for 10 years. I am not going to apologize for that to anyone in this room. Not today. Not ever." A reporter shouted a question. Several reporters shouted questions. Ji-hoon ignored all of them. "I have one more thing to say," he said, "and I'm aware it is not traditionally done at a press conference." A ripple of uncertain laughter moved through the room. He didn't smile. He stepped out from behind the podium and actually walked across the lobby floor, cameras tracking him with frantic energy, until he was standing 10 feet from Ava. She could not breathe. He reached into his jacket pocket. "I told you I'd come back," he said, quietly enough that the room had to go silent to hear him, and every camera in the room was now aimed at the two of them. "I told you I'd come back successful, and I wouldn't let you struggle again." He opened the small box in his hand. "I'm a little late, but I'm here." He dropped to one knee. The lobby erupted. Ava pressed both hands over her mouth. Her eyes were burning. The cameras were everywhere, and the reporters were shouting, and the board members behind the glass were a blur. She couldn't focus on, because the only thing in her vision was Ji-hoon, kneeling on the marble floor of his own company's lobby, looking up at her with the expression she'd seen on him in that rooftop photo. Unguarded, open, completely without armor. "Ava Shin," he said, "will you marry me?" She was crying. She was definitely crying, in front of 200 reporters and 17 cameras and the entire board of directors. And she found that she did not care even slightly. She nodded. He slid the ring onto her finger and stood, and she grabbed the front of his jacket with both hands and pulled him toward her. And the lobby of Hanil Group headquarters became the loudest place in Seoul for about 90 seconds. The wedding was small and intentional. They had both had enough of spectacle. They chose 50 people, family friends, close colleagues, a few people from the foster care system who had mattered to both of them, and held it in a garden venue outside Seoul on a Saturday in late spring. Ava wore something she had designed herself, because of course she did. Simple and structured, with a detail at the hem she'd been sketching for years, without knowing what it was for. Ji-hoon wore a charcoal suit and looked at her walking toward him, like a man seeing the thing he'd been looking for finally come into focus. The vows